I'm more senior.
Look, the point about it for me is that Brigid's everything, and there are no limits to what you can possibly do and to what you can possibly achieve. And we know that there are different connotations of Brigid and different guises of Brigid that people seem to get very excited about in terms of her being a pagan, in terms of her being a goddess, in terms of whatever. What you're talking about when it comes to Brigid 1500 is the 1500th anniversary of the death of Saint Brigid, which is possibly 524 AD. Actually, it's listed in the sources as anywhere between 519 and 570 or something. And when you try and find her birth, it's the same sort of thing. When you try and find out when she began her monastery in Kildare, it's open to interpretation. Okay, and that's great for us because it allows us to do so much. Okay, it allows us imagine the greatest possible scenarios. And in terms of what we're really interested in when it comes to Brigid is the example that she sets for us all, in terms of her generosity, in terms of her spirit, in terms of her legacy, in terms of the fact that it's a woman, and when most women were not included in the written histories. And in fact, she's the first Irish-born saint, as far as I can tell, and she is certainly one of the first, if not the first, Irish female saint. Well, she's the first Irish-born female saint, sorry. And she is the first female saint to be listed in the hagiographies, which is a very fancy word for history of saints, basically. What you're talking about, our greatest experiences or our greatest knowledge comes from two particular sources in terms of the wealth and the value of sources that we have. And mainly that would come from Cogitosus's Life of Brigid. Cogitosus, we imagine to have been a monk in Kildare, roughly about 650 AD. So, I mean, if Brigid died in 524, it's barely over a generation, a couple of generations that Cogitosus is here. And he is actually looking at the physical. In parts of his history, he mentions some of the physical characteristics of the church, which were in evidence to him. So he's not just talking about legends and stories that were handed down, although much of his work is I suppose, it's woven around the miracles of Brigid. I mean, he lists 32 miracles. But he actually also spends time describing the town, or what he calls the metropolitan city of Kildare. And then again, we have a visit. An important one is often overlooked. Is we've a visit on a monk who is not very kind to the Irish, or a cleric called Giraldus Cambrensis. Was he a cleric? I don't know anymore. Giraldus of Wales, Giraldus Cambrensis. He comes with the Normans and he visits Ireland, I think on 2 occasions, and he's in Kildare around 1182 or something like that. And he describes just what we now know as the Book of Kildare. Which was so beautiful it must have been created by the angels. And if anybody knows of Josephine Hardiman, you know the work that she's been doing on this. And again, that's tying us back to the time of Brigid. He also introduces us to the firehouse, the fire temple, and these great stories about the Normans who were, no man was allowed into the fire temple. That if you went into the fire temple, it was only women. And one particular Norman, the kids loved this one, he decided to brave it out, and he stayed in the fire temple, and the next morning sure wasn't a fierce thirst on him. And then he went from house to house trying to get a drop of water or whatever was available until he drank so much that he burst and died. And the children loved the bursting and more than anything else. But the point what I'm saying about those is that those sources are available to download online. You know, you get a wonderful translation of Cogitosus's work, which is I think the first saint's life that was written in Hiberno Latin, a combination of Irish and Latin, and Sean Connolly and a gentleman called Picard, their interpretation of it is probably the most valued, and that's available to download online. And also you can find Cambrensis and his descriptions of Kildare. And it's important because we're talking about a time when the Normans come, and the Normans come in 1169, and you're wondering, what is that got to do with Brigid? The fact that the Normans come here and they build a stone cathedral, the fact that they have 3 abbeys develop on the outskirts of the town, demonstrating importance some 500 odd years after the death of Brigid. And it is still a place of pilgrimage. The landscape, the streetscape that we know of Kildare is probably changed very, very little since early medieval times. And there are 12 roads converging on Kildare. Kildare was a place of pilgrimage. Before Brigid, it's built along this ridge. It's called the Ridge of Clay, Drim Cree. And that is one of these 5 magical roads which sprang up on the night of the birth of Con Céad Cathal, Con of the 100 Battles. One of the 5 magical roads which leads to Tara. That's this area. We've got Fionn McCool and Athena, and their headquarters was on the Hill of Allen. Their playground, their training ground was the Curragh of Kildare and the nearby Red Hills, where they would have learned the arts of filioque and storytelling and so on, as well as obviously the training to be warriors. So bringing it all back together is, and why does Brigid come to Kildare? And it's a very, very important question, especially if you're from County Louth and you have this sad idea that she was born there. And what we know, and Tom can verify this, he has the signpost, it's rumoured that she was born at Ummerus in County Kildare. And it really is kind of sensible that she would have had an understanding or an attachment to the area. And it's impossible to prove either way. She appears as being born in County Louth from sources which date as early as the 12th century. So there is a long provenance to that story as well. And you know what? We can share. You know, there is plenty of room in there for all of us. But the point about it is that if she was local to this area, then that's why she would have understood and set up her church in an area which she was familiar, an area which was well travelled by people along the Sligola, and an area which is ultimately becomes important because of the establishment by her of this church, a wooden church, but a very large structure which accommodated men and women. And again, that idea of a double monastery is something fabulous to work on. The idea of her communing with nature and her authority, as Cogitosus describes it, over the beasts of the earth, you know. And again, very much when you're dealing with miracles, you get these kind of superhuman powers, you know, which will attach themselves to people. But what they're really ultimately doing is demonstrating how important that character was in their story. When we talk locally of a place called Lochmanan, where I live now, it's attached to Brigid in that the story goes, there were 18 bishops and they were coming to Kildare, and so Brigid had to feed them all. And what she does is she sends out the nuns, her followers, to milk the cows. And they said, oh, Sir Brigid, we can't. We're after milking the cows already. And she said, she falls to her knees in prayer and she says, go out and milk the cows again. And they bring the vessels with them, and so much milk comes forward that it spills over the lids, the rims of the vessels, and creates a lake of new milk, Loch Lomnata. But what people don't listen for or don't understand is that there were 18 bishops coming to see Brigid. You know, how important was she? You know, and that's a story which has attached itself to nearly all those legacies and all those early miracle stories. And we have the attachment of Rathbride. We have, of course, Bride Street in Kildare Town. So again, looking at the landscape is a great way and a great place for us to find inspiration. Rathbride on the edge of the Curragh, where the Whartstone now stands, where people tried to get me to dance around the Whartstone some years ago, but we don't do that. I had a camera, thank God, and I took pictures of everybody else dancing. Where is Terry Hennessy? But what I'm trying to say is that it's an open blank canvas. You know, I mean, the sources are there, the stories are there, the children still love it. I mean, we go into the schools and you tell the stories and the miracles of Brigid. They are. It's very difficult in a Educate Together now. How do you talk about Christian saints? You know, I tend to talk about them as very magical sort of stories and whatever, but it's still of interest to us today. And what I'm saying is, if you're looking for inspiration in terms of the type of work you can do, then there is a huge body to work from. a huge lot of sources, even though the first thing anybody will admit to you is that we know very little about Brigid that we can prove. People will constantly argue whether she existed or whether she don't, and yet they don't argue whether the Bishop MacHale and all these other people who feature in the stories existed. I think it's fair to say that we have a historical personage. What is important for us and why it became important about the story and why develop it into an idea of Brigid 1500 is that she singularly represents all these magical great things for us. And I don't mean magical in a kind of Harry Potter way. I'm talking about it in a wondrous way. In terms of Brigid is, somebody that we can aspire to be. I mean, the message of Brigid is still as relevant. And I'm not like an overly religious person trying to sell a particular trend. What I'm trying to do is to study somebody of work, somebody as if you're reading a biography. So Brigid has all these traits which are so important to us. She has these other alter egos, whereas there's a pagan goddess. There is an earth woman or earth goddess, whatever way we want to look at it. And that actually really appeals to people, and that's fantastic. I mean, again, in another ilk. The stories of the various animals, whether it's her outwitting the king with her cloak and attaching herself or attaching the Curragh of Kildare to her small monastery, or she's outwitting the king by setting up a replacement for the little fox. And I'm teasing you because I'm not telling you the stories because you're going to have to go off and do the work yourself. But when you're looking for inspiration, you're looking for that kind of connections and these different possibilities. And whether it's a range of different animals which feature, whether it's the fact that she gives away her father's jewels or she gives away the beautiful vestments of Conrad. What it is it's telling us that she had no attachment to worldly goods, that she is supremely generous, and that her whole message is her belief that Christ is a guest in everyone else, and I mean that she's constantly looking after the poor, and she's constantly looking after everybody who comes to her. I mean, she was worn out, I'd say, by the end, because I mean, everybody from kings to noblemen, to lepers, to people destitute, were coming to Brigid for aid, and she rarely, if ever, has turned them away. So I'm not sure, Brian, is that kind of interesting enough? Brian saw me once, and we have a history, so he felt sorry for me, and that's it. But I mean, the thing about it is, what you were talking about was cogitosis, is that we forget sometimes that we get immersed in this idea that there was a saint and we can't really prove it and the whole lot. Go back and look at those sources. Look at what cogitosis says. And it's written in good old plain English, thank God. It's not written in the kind of medieval script which we'd find difficult to understand. And that can give you an enormous insight into where it can bring you, I mean, and really there should be no limit to it. When this began, I think he first had the idea about after the gathering in 2013, and it began as Bring Brigid Home. And certain ladies in the area thought we were going to reassemble the saint bone by bone. That I might have had a strange idea, but we won't go into that. But thankfully it's changed to Brigid 1500. It's now being led by Kildare County Council and as Brigid 1500. And it truly should be, a massively important national event. And there should be a legacy from this, that it's not just about events next year. Or in fairness, this year, we were on the Curragh yesterday. I mean, the Kildare County Council, Marion Higgins figure I got was 5,000 people on the Curragh yesterday, which is fabulous. And again, by branding that we were still wondering, the connections of Brigid. The Curragh is the place where our cloak, that fabled story. And branding, it is bringing Brigid to the attention of people who may not have had that other interest before. And when you see these family days, I mean, it's marvellous. We were at a Brigid and the Wolves film, which was created by a local group in County Kildare called Youth Inc., supported by Kildare County Council and Christy Cashman at Kildare Castle. Marvellous what those kids done. And just using film and using the stories of Brigid and the Wolves and adapting it into a modern setting. And it was a fantastic night. And that's going to go on the circuit, and it's going to play all the festivals. As I said, Josephine Hardiman's been working for years on this beautiful, beautiful book. But there's no limit. It's not just one St. Bridget's cross. There are at least probably 12 or 14 different kinds of crosses. There are all the different kind of animals. There are all the stories. There are the areas in Ireland which are attached to the story of Brigid. And then there's that essence of Brigid, which is the generosity, which is the example to us all of how we could possibly live our lives to the betterment of other people. So the world is your oyster, as they say. And the library is available to you. I'll give you James Durney's phone number now and the lads will be busy. But there are great attachments. One thing about the library, modern libraries, is that you can actually book. If you find a book in a library anywhere in the country, the likelihood is that you can probably get it sent to you here or to your local library, so that you're actually picking from the entire catalogue of the country, which opens it up massively. But I have assembled, I'd say, about 25 different kind of PDF texts on Brigid over the years. There is a lot of material out there, and a lot of discussion over, the existence or the saint versus goddess and so on. But all of that should be used to actually, inform us and to make us and to challenge us. Because if you're challenged as an artist, it is inspiring. It is something that makes it maybe a bit more cutting edge and gives us greater possibility. And I don't think we should be restricted in any shape or form by a set story. There is there's just so much more to this than what we imagine first when we touch on it. I'm glad I used all those slides. Is there anybody as a question, or would you prefer that we do the questions at the end with everybody?
I don't mind. What do we think?
I don't know, how am I doing on time? Am I taking up everybody's time?
No, you're all right.
People can't, I'm so shy. I don't really talk. It's stopping me is the problem. Does anybody want to?
Can we have access to your PDFs then? How do we get to hold it and to look at that? Just the library app?
No, to mine. I'd say
You have them
€25 per I'll send you a couple. Anybody who wants those. The most important one is the cogitosis one, and I do have that. But there are some that are a bit kind of, I don't think you need to read them. I don't think I needed to read them. To be honest.
Just cogitosis.
Yeah,
whatever it is. It
sounds like a disease.
English now, Mario. It wasn't written in English.
It was written in Hiberno Latin, which is Irish English. Old Irish. So again. But this guy, Sean Connolly. No, thankfully, Sean Connolly and this gentleman Picard. And it's a really, apart from the fact that there's a useful introduction, it breaks down the stories. Honestly, there are 32 miracles, and you could base a piece of work on nearly any part of that, because it's that one thing that kind of can inspire you. But he also gives a description of Kildare. And a wonderful, there's these things thrown in like metropolitan city, The fact that there were no walls limiting it, and that the fact that people could come here if they were guilty of a crime and they couldn't be touched because they were living within the confines of the town. There's all these beautiful stories that can be, whether you're writing a novel, whether you're writing a play, whether you're creating a piece of work, a work of art or music, that can inspire, you know. So if anybody does want that, it's just mcorrigan@kildareco.ie, and I'll dig them out for you and send on a few. They are interesting, or I can send them to Pamela,
Yeah.
and Pamela can send them on to everybody.
How do you spell it?
The which?
How do you spell that big word?
Cogitosis.
C-O-R-R-I-G-A-N. Cogitosis, I presume. C-O-G-I-T-O-S-U-S. Jansen. But I mean, the point was that he lived in the area where Brigid had been, and that he was a monk of the monastery. He's mentioned in the work, there was arguments over whether it was 850 or whatever, but he's mentioned in a work that was published prior to 680 AD. So it's assumed that he actually lived here in Kildare, working in the monastery, in what would have been the scriptorium. And he assembles this account of Brigid. And he speaks of Connacht, and he speaks of, as I say, he actually describes the creation of the church, the structure of the church, and how it was divided not into two, men and women, but three. It was men, women, and the hoi polloi, who were at the top with the archbishops and the important people. But they were separated by these wooden partitions. But there were beautiful wall hangings and decorations. They were above the tombs of Brigid, which he described as actually above ground tombs, you know. And we assume the entire bodies were there at that stage. Sorry, Regent, I'm bringing that back up again. Not just relics or not just parts, but that they were entombed. Connacht and Brigid were entombed on the left and right of the altar. And above that were basically chandeliers. So there are these vivid depictions of what the church would have looked like, which again in itself is a wonderful source if you're trying to write, whether that's or paint or compose or whatever else. So it's certainly worthwhile. And yes, I can go on. So we don't really want to. And I know it's about being flippant and that, but the thing about it is that if you don't want to comment, just imagine that it's all difficult and hard to get into the back to the sources, and don't get sidetracked by the big debate about whether she was a Christian saint or Christian goddess. Brigid 1500 is celebrating the death of the saint in 524 AD. The fact that there is this other debate out there is marvellous. I mean, it's just absolutely amazing, and it opens it up so much. One of the ideas that was, there was a report done on Brigid 1500, which is available on the Brigid 1500 website. So, I mean, great ideas in that. It was compiled by Abarta Heritage, who had actually worked on the 1500th anniversary sesquimillennial. There's a word for you. Don't ask me to spell that. Sesquimillennial, the 1500th anniversary of Columba. And again, if you want inspiration, look at that report, because it actually suggests what could be done. And in many respects, we felt there wasn't enough of a wow factor. It didn't go maybe far enough, but there is a body of work in there. In terms of just giving people ideas, so that's worth it as well. I will allow somebody else to speak now, and